Let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for bringing us together on the Sabbath day. And Lord, as I come to bring this message, Lord, let these words be your words and allow everyone to gain a blessing from this message. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, sermon is the 2,300 days and start breaking it up into a few parts. So this is part one. The ram and the goat part. Daniel 8:14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. This text is one that is central to Daniel chapter 8, and is one that isn't given enough attention. It is what the events of this chapter are based upon. In this series, we will examine the evidence for this. The first vision of chapter 7 took place in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. But by the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, when this vision takes place, Babylon isn't even mentioned because her demise is nigh, and her cup has reached the limits of her transgressions. And we're all familiar with the demise of Babylon. It was mentioned in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel 8 opens with the vision of a ram that had two horns, and the horns were of different heights. Daniel 8:3. Then I lifted up mine eyes, and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the other came up last. The ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the horns represents the two kingdoms that made up this empire, the Medes and the Persians. At the kingdom's inception, the Medes were the dominant power, but as time passed, the Persians far surpassed the Medes in power and rose to prominence because the balance of power shifted in their favor. History substantiates this. The representation of the horn higher than the other is parallel to the bear that was raised up on one side in Daniel chapter 7. The raising up on one side, higher than the other, depicted the unequal balance within that power. The higher horn had come up last, and that agrees with the historical narrative of the Persians rising to dominance after the Medo-Persian Empire ascended to power. To Daniel 8, verses 4. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. The ram was pushing, meaning that it was waging war. The word translated as push is the Aramaic word nagah, which means to war against. To the westward and northward and southward direction, it was expanding its borders through conquest. Using the geographical location of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians as a point of origin, from the west of that point was Babylon, and to the south of that point was Egypt, and to the north of it was Lydia. These were the three kingdoms that the Medes and the Persians conquered to become the dominant world power. And this also corresponds with the three ribs in the mouth of the bear. No kingdoms could stand against this power, and it conquered every country that it faced in its rise to power. Its empire at its height had 127 provinces from Africa to India. This is the second beast from Daniel 7 that arose and devoured much flesh. This kingdom became great, and the Bible is correct in that. On to verses 5 and 6. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west, on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran into him in the fury of his power. The next beast that arose on the worst stage is the he-goat, and this goat was traveling so fast that his feet didn't even touch the ground when he was moving. And this goat had a notable horn, or king, and history tells us that Alexander the Great was his king. He was the first king of the Grecian Empire that dominated the world. The west was the directions that the Greeks had to come from to invade the Medes and the Persians. This goat also runs at the ram with fury. In verse 21 of Daniel chapter 8, Gabriel tells Daniel that the notable horn was the Grecian Empire's first king. Now to verses 6 and 7. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him. And there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hands. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones towards the winds of the 4 heavens. 4 winds of heaven. Goes on to say a little more about the fury, or the rage of the he-goat, and he was moving at the ram with great rage because he was provoked. The Greeks under Alexander were roused to action in retaliation to the invasion of the Medes and the Persians. That's why the goat was moving with great rage. The swiftness of the goat is parallel to the 4 wings on the leopard from Daniel chapter 7. This kingdom expanded with rapid speed. Alexander the Great conquered the then known world in a very short period of time, which was 3 years. And that was astonishing speed to conquer the entire world, given the time. At the height of his power, Alexander the Great, after a few days of riotous drinking, took ill and died. His kingdom eventually divided into 4 parts, and his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, controlled all his territory. But the empire was never as strong as it was under Alexander, and became weaker until the next kingdom succeeded it. Under Alexander the Great, the kingdom became very great. Verse 7 and 8 tells us that because the he-goat conquered the ram, he became very great. And we can see this because after verse 7 described the goat crushing the ram in a conflict, verse 8 begins with, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. So to put it simply, the very greatness achieved by Greece came by conquest. So let's keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that idea a little bit later. Daniel, verse 8 and 9. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great, even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. The little horn started off with horizontal conquests. The 2 directions and the location that was given alludes to this. Those directions were the directions that the Romans moved to expand their empire. By this reason, it must be describing the expansion of the Roman Empire. Some have tried to attribute this horn to Antiochus Epiphanes, but this cannot be possible, and here are a few reasons why. Number 1, Antiochus Epiphanes was the 8th Seleucid king in a line of 26 kings who ruled the Seleucid kingdom. Consequently, that makes him one of the 4 horns, thus excluding him from being the little horn that comes next. Number 2, in relation to the ram which became great, and the he-goat which became very great, this little horn becomes exceedingly great. Can anybody tell me who Antiochus Epiphanes is? No? Or what he's known for? If you were to ask someone about Antiochus Epiphanes, most people wouldn't have a clue of who he is, and why is that? Because of his insignificance in history. He wasn't even important enough to warrant any notable mention. There is no possibility that Antiochus Epiphanes is exceedingly great. This exceedingly great power can be no other power than the Romans. The ram who represented the Medes and the Persians waxed great. Then the Greeks were symbolized by the he-goat who waxes very great because they conquered the Medes and the Persians. And for that reason, the little horn has to be a stronger power than the Greeks, because it has been said to have waxed very great. When we saw that the Medes and Persians became great from the destruction of the three leading kingdoms, then the Greeks became great because it destroyed the Medes and the Persians. And by that reason alone, the little horn had to have become exceedingly great because it conquered the Greeks. It is clearly shown that each successive kingdom achieves their greatness this way, by conquest. In those verses, there is a clear indication of an increase in power with each successive kingdom. There was only one kingdom in ancient history that surpassed the Greek Empire in power, and that was the Roman Empire. They were the only power to wax exceedingly great in comparison to the other two powers mentioned. The next verse shows a change in the expansion of the power. It switched from a horizontal flight with other earthly nations to a vertical flight of a spiritual nature. Number 3, a Roman ambassador by the name of Gaius Popilius Apuleius presented Antiochus with the ultimatum that he evacuate Egypt and Cyprus immediately after his ally Perseus of Macedonia was defeated at Pydna. Antiochus, taken by surprise, asked for time to consider. Popilius disregarded his request and drew a circle in the earth around the king with his walking stick and demanded an unequivocal answer before Antiochus left the circle. Dismayed by his public humiliation, the king quickly agreed to comply. This is not the actions of a king that is exceedingly great. The power whose authority he recognized was the exceedingly great power, but that was not him. Number 4, the little horn stood up to the princes of princes. Antiochus Epiphanes died in 164 BC, long before Christ came to the earth. This is a major point of failure for the people identifying Antiochus Epiphanes as the little horn. He was also called Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the Mad. He was quite crazy. Number 5, Antiochus Epiphanes paid a heavy tribute to the Roman Empire. A kingdom that was greater in power than the Greek Empire would have never paid tribute to anyone. The predominant powers are the ones who impose tributes on the conquered kingdoms or the kingdoms that are fearful of being run over by those powers. Each preceding power was the highest power in the world during their reign. There was none above them. As a result, any king or kingdom that paid tribute to another must be excluded from being this exceedingly great power. It was impossible for Antiochus to fit this description. That was a typo. It should be Daniel 8, verses 23 to 27. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to full, a king of fierce countenances and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without head. It says that in the latter time of their kingdom, which is the kingdom of the 4 horns, or the 4 divisions of Greece, when their transgressions are come to full, a king of fierce countenance, which isn't of their kingdom, he stands up or begins to rule. Standing up is a term to describe rulership. When the transgressions come to a full, the kingdoms come to an end, because the cup of iniquity is full. The word translated as full also means destroyed. Consequently, when the transgressors are destroyed, a king of fierce countenance stands up or begins to rule, giving further evidence that the kingdom of Greece is destroyed. The next power rules because of the destruction of the 4 horns. This also proves that the little horn cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes. because he did not destroy the 4 divisions of priests. Now that we have established that the horn cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, let us continue to look at where the evidence points to as the identity of the little horn. Number 1, it starts out small and becomes great. In Daniel 8, verses 9, it said, out of one of them there came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. And then in verse 8 of Daniel 7, it says, behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by its roots. And number 2, this power persecutes the saints. Daniel 8, 24 and 25. And he shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And then in verse 25 it says, he shall also stand up against the prince of princes. And then in Daniel 7, verses 21 and 25, it said, the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. And then it goes on to say, they shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and a dividing of time. It's pretty clear that this little horn is a persecuting power, and it's warring against the saints. Number 3, they both appear for lengthy periods in prophetic time. Daniel 8:14 says, unto 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. And in Daniel 7:25, it says that they shall be given into his hand until the time and times and the dividing of time. We know that's the 1,260 years. Number 4, they are both stopped by divine intervention, broken without hand. The heavenly judgment takes away the dominion. In Daniel 8:25, it's at the end it says, he shall be broken without hand. And in Daniel 7:26 it says, but the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume it and destroy it unto the end. We know that the judgment takes place in heaven, and that there is no human involvement in the investigative judgment in heaven. Hence, the judgment takes away the kingdom of the little horn, and he is broken without human hands. Number 5, both the little horn in Daniel 7 and 8 has power that comes from somewhere else. And Daniel 8:24 says, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And in Daniel 7 verses 8 it says, describes the horns being plucked up by the roots in verses 8 and verse 20. And then in verse 25 it talks about the little horn subduing 3 kings. The little horn is shown to have uprooted the 3 kingdoms in verse 24, but it was not by his own power. And verse 24 of Daniel chapter 8 allows us to, shows us that, saying that his power was mighty but not by his own power. So in essence, Daniel chapter 8 verses 8 verses 24 sums up the 3 verses about the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. From this we can safely say that the little horn in Daniel chapter 8 is the same power that was mentioned as the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. And instead of seeing Rome in successive stages in chapter 7, in chapter 8 it represents it as one entity, because each stage of Rome is just a continuation of Rome, so it's the same power to the end. And again, we see that the little horn is tied to a time period, this time the 2,300 days. As in chapter 7, a period of prophetic time is associated with the little horn, and detail is given about the little horn, so that we can use the timing of that power to place the timing of events that are taking place in heaven. This prophecy also confirms the accuracy of the prophecy in chapter 7 and adds another layer of detail. Daniel chapter 8 is following the repeat and enlarged principle that we saw going from Daniel chapter 2 to chapter 7 and now on to chapter 8. We've seen a repeat of the kingdoms, except for Babylon, because it was on the verge of falling. But the order of the kingdoms is identical, and the description of the little horn is undeniable. And now there was another piece of information added at the 2,300 days. This will be discussed in the next sermon. We can see that the Lord is very clear about the description of the little horn to let us know the timing of his work. Thank God that we serve a God who sees the end from the beginning and reveals it to his servants, the prophets, so that when it comes to pass, that we will believe.